That's the calls that I've heard them make.
In the tropical forests of Australia,
They find kangaroos with their heads ripped off.
a hairy, imposing monster.
That's when they saw the creature reaching over my car and shaking it from side to side.
They could hear the footsteps thumping away, and then they heard them behind them.
Terrorizes all who dare approach it.
Something is here, something's around us. Don't anyone move.
Beware the Yowie. Queensland, Australia. Because of its 300 days of blue sky each year, Australians have nicknamed it the Sunshine State. More than 2 million tourists flock there every year to discover the Gold Coast's beautiful beaches and breathtaking scenery. Its hinterland consists of a string of small villages encircled by some of the richest and densest forests in Australia. But what visiting nature lovers do not know is that the Yowie, a large, hairy, and aggressive biped, also calls these forests home. Ron Quinton understands the danger. For this native of the region, there's no doubt that these tropical forests hide the Yowie.
When I was younger, we used to do a lot of motocross riding through the bush. And I'd see strange things like snapped trees and holes dug as though something was looking for water, and it wasn't, like they weren't natural, and like paths lead into nowhere. They're just too far out for any human to even bother doing that. I didn't think much of it back then, and then just as years go by, you see the odd newspaper clip, oh, Yowie sighted. And then I think back to, like I said, when I was younger, when we used to go out the bush all the time and see all these snap trees, and apparently they're what they call their territorial markers.
And on one excursion, Ron Quinton had an encounter he will never forget.
About 6 months ago, my son and nephew, we went for a drive out to a section of track, and it was a dead end onto a little creek. There was a gully down beside me, just led into thick scrub. I could hear something moving through the gully as I was walking back to the car. We were in the middle of nowhere. Nobody was down there. You could hear this thing plain as day walking like parallel with me as I was walking back. This thing was walking. So then I'd wave to my son to come a bit closer, and as he was coming closer, we could hear rocks banging together down in this gully. Something was bashing rocks together. It was just bang, bang. And there was birds further down the track just going ballistic. I've never heard anything like it in my life. Jumped in the car and hightailed out. Yeah, chickens. I've seen enough evidence to know that it's not human activity that's out there.
Less than an hour's drive from the Yowie's wilderness lies Brisbane, the dynamic capital of the state of Queensland.
My name is Daniel Geschwind. I work for the Queensland Tourism Industry Council. We are in the capital of Queensland, Brisbane. Australia was only settled by immigrants from Europe just over 200 years ago. It had a native population, of course, who is still very much present and very much a part of this country. Since settlement here, the city has evolved very rapidly from a slumbering country town only maybe 30 or 40 years ago to a modern, vibrant city that can now position itself as genuinely a global and world city from such humble beginnings. But in that evolution, we have retained a friendly character. The lifestyle is what the locals enjoy, and that lifestyle is also what attracts visitors, we believe, in our great cultural institutions that we now have in the city, galleries, performing arts centres. This city reaches out to the green and blue, fabulous coastlines within 1 or 2 hours of the city centre here. It has an incredible surf break in many places, very popular weekend destinations, and very popular destinations for our overseas visitors as well. You are here very much still in touch with nature and the environment. One of the things that amazes visitors from most places in the world when they come here is the sense of space, whether that's on the ocean, in the hinterland, the rainforest environment, remnant rainforests that very much are intact, like they used to be thousands of years ago, before the times of our continents shaping as they are today. A lot of people camp around here. Of course, camping is a big thing in Australia, and there's all sorts of noises going on here at night when you camp somewhere out in the bush. And like everywhere else, there's always a bit of mystery, and there's nowhere better than here to have a bit of mystery. We have a lot of blank, unexplored spaces still, with lots of inaccessible terrain. Who knows what lurks there?
Many Australians also believe that these forests are full of mystery. And here, everyone has heard of the Yowie.
Oh yeah, it's been talked about for a long, long time.
There's claimed to be sightings all up the east coast of Queensland.
Oh well, apparently in the 70s, I think, they said that there was a Yowie sighting.
And I think people that saw him only got a glimpse of him.
Either he's a very fast runner or, you know, there's obviously more than one.
These myths, or whether they're real or not, come from Aboriginal culture, I think.
Pretty hairy sort of a man, fairly big.
Do I believe in it personally? No.
With stories like that back in the Aboriginal dream time, well, I think it makes it more credible. It's good to keep an open mind.
In this region of Queensland, one man spends all his free time in search of the Yowie.
My name is Ray Doherty. I am a Yowie / wildlife researcher / photographer. During the real time, I work in the corporate finance industry. And we've been researching Yowies very heavily, almost obsessively, for 5-6 years now. Even though Australia is almost the size of the United States, 45% of our country has never been discovered. It's never been explored, 45%. So that means there's a lot of land left where these things could easily live in seclusion. But what we're finding through witness reports and through the work of other researchers is that these things are coming closer to the city, and more people are finally being brave enough to stick their hand up and say, yes, we've had an experience or we've had an encounter with something that fits that profile.
Accounts of the Yowie describe an imposing creature standing 2 to 3 meters or 6 to 9 feet tall, its muscular body covered in brown or black fur. Experts describe it as timid, but considering Ray Doherty's encounter with the monster, it can also prove to be violent and aggressive.
One of my great passions is astrophotography. We were stargazing about 3 o'clock, 2:30 in the morning. The weather moved in, and we couldn't see anything with the clouds, and because my friends tell me I have a bad snoring problem, so they made me sleep in the car. At about 3:30 in the morning, I felt something brush up against my car, and it was growling, and I thought it was my friends playing a joke. So I kicked the window, thinking it was them playing a game, and then it was getting really loud and really quite a few roars and things of that nature, and this thing just started rocking my car and shaking me from side to side, and it was pitch black, and I couldn't see anything. I mean, I could feel something against the car, I could hear it, I could feel the roof of the car, the popping in. The whole thing only went for maybe a minute or two, but it felt like 10, 15 minutes. But my friends came out of the house with a high-powered spotlight, and that's when they saw the creature reaching over my car and shaking it from side to side. And then they called at it, and it roared back at them, and then it took off over the fence and it ran away. I got out of the car, I had a busted shoulder, I had a busted eye. The roof of my car was dented in from elbows pushing down as it reached over the car, and you know, it had to be 8 foot tall, 700-800 pounds or 300-400 kilos, and it was wrapped over my car and it wasn't happy. So I started 6 years ago really investigating reports at first, and then we developed a theory, and we started trying to prove that theory, and then we got a lot of results, and then we got more results. So this is continuation along that theory and building networks with scientists and educational institutions in order to help us validate any evidence we get. You know, we think we're getting close, slowly but surely. We're getting close.
As part of his research, Ray Doherty contacted the most famous Australian cryptozoologist, Gary Opet.
So I'm approached by a lot of people like Ray Doherty and other researchers that have seen strange things in the forest. And so the Yowie, it looks very much like the general impression of a Yeti or a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch. It looks very much like a large ape-like creature. The sightings are very similar. There's been both males and females, and the females have mammary glands, mammaries. So it tends to show that they're most likely to be a true primate. The females and young very rarely recorded, nearly always encounters with males. They act very similar to encountering gorillas in the Congo. They don't like being seen, so they seem, I would imagine, to live in very small numbers and have very large territories. But of course, we've got no physical evidence of their existence whatsoever, which makes it so interesting. It's a true mystery.
Despite the lack of hard evidence definitely proving the Yowie's existence, sightings continue to rise.
There's countless, hundreds and hundreds of stories of people of all different walks of life that have seen these things in the flesh. Even if 99% of them are bullshitting, there's 1% that's not. And we had a bit of an incident here, the nephew and myself, would have been about 2 months ago. A couple of rangers come through and they pulled over, and I just got into a conversation and said, oh look, yeah, there's a couple of areas in there that are a bit spooky. You hear guys talking about they find kangaroos with their heads ripped off and all this sort of stuff, you know. And they said to me, look mate, you wouldn't believe what goes on in here. And this is all thick forestry, and they wouldn't elaborate anymore, and just jumped in the car and drove off.
Gary Opet was a forest ranger in the area in the 1970s, and he has seen his fair share of strange and unexplained phenomena.
And one night, something began beating upon the ranger's quarters, which is just a small cabin in the rainforest, then went under the house and threw all our tools out onto the lawn. And this was in pitch blackness, and this powerful series of roars came out of the forest, unlike anything I'd ever heard before, like, yee, 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 booming call, and we wondered what on earth could do that. There was no animals that did that. Shortly afterwards, I think it was, that the head ranger came face to face with one. He was cutting through a fallen tree that had fallen across the walking track and came face to face with an animal unlike anything that anyone had ever seen before. He went into virtual shock, and they said it had a shiny black face, had a crested head like a sagittal crest. It was just like a gorilla to him. But he said it wasn't a gorilla. You can see it was a bit different. It was more bipedal. And that's the first time we had an idea of what this animal might look like. Because I was a natural skeptic, like, how could this animal exist without us knowing about it? You know, after 200 years of European settlement, but we've only got reports. That's the situation. The Yowie.
In this wild region of Queensland, one village claims to be the world capital of all things Yowie, Kilcoy.
Kilcoy is a beautiful little country town with a lot of character that is going back maybe 100 years. You know, the lifestyle there is still very visible and reminiscent of how it used to be when the early settlers came here.
We're almost exactly 100 kilometres from the middle of Brisbane.
John McCauley, a retired farmer, is passionate about the history of the region and the legend of Yowie.
First settled in the middle of the 1800s. Always been a grazing area, but also very big timber industry in the early days. There were many sawmills here, hardwood sawmills. It's a small country town, about 2,000 people. Not much different in size to when I was a boy. But that hotel on your left, the Exchange, it's been there since probably the 1930s. Other than that, many of the shops have been here since the very early days of Kilcoy. You'll notice there's a fair bit of traffic here, and that's because it's also the main highway through Kilcoy. There is no bypass, so all the traffic going from the coast has to come down this main street.
In 1979, 2 young Kilcoy residents claimed to have seen the Yowie while out in the forests. The story caught the attention of all of Australia.
There were 2 young high school kids camped in a creek out here, pig shooting, only about 4 kilometres from town here, quite close really, and they believed they heard and then saw a Yowie. One of them took a shot at it. He doesn't know whether he hit it, but it took off. And then they claimed that they could hear it. They could hear the footsteps thumping around, thumping away, and then they heard them behind them. They reckon they could hear this Yowie following them. They were scared, of course, and they ended up coming back to town in the middle of the night. And, you know, Yowie hunters from all over Australia descended on Kilcoy. It became big news. It was in all the magazines and papers and TV crews. So that's where the legend started.
The mayor at the time then decided to erect a statue to celebrate the unusual event, as well as to enshrine the Yowie as Kilcoy's official mascot.
It was cut out of a single tree and put up in the park in 1980 or thereabouts to work the legend for all it was worth. The last reported sighting of the Yowie was in the Sandy Creek area in December 1979, and it appears in Aboriginal folklore dating back thousands of years. When the white settlers arrived in Australia in 1788, the legends were already here amongst the Aborigines. The reports go right back to that date of white people actually seeing them. Since then, they've been seen all over the place, but there are sort of hot spots where more reports than usual come from, shall we say. There's a suburb of Sydney, the biggest city in Australia, called Yowie Bay, because that's where, in those very early times, was famous for its Yowie sightings.
But these sightings out here have been going on for hundreds of years. Up to 200 years, ever since first settlement. The Aboriginals always talked about the hairy man. Yeah, so it's a long history.
The Aboriginal people had a number of names for them depending upon their locality and their dialect, and one of the names was Yowie. The Aboriginal people talk about them as being an inhabitant of this land, but animals that are very secretive and very rare and very rarely encountered. The Aboriginal people say we walked with them, they were our cousins. We didn't harm them and they didn't harm us. And they're not to be frightened of, but they can be a bit frightening. But the fact that the Aboriginal people have names for these things is evidence that they knew about something that we don't know about.
Were the Aboriginals the first to see the Yowie? Teek St. Rode, a lover of Aboriginal culture, considers it necessary to understand their language to trace the origins of the Yowie.
Now, they didn't really have that many words. We're trying to word things that were really never worded. They named everything after sounds. So depending on what the sound made or what the colours, depending on what they were, you know, what they called it. You know, it's like, you know, you hear children go, ooh, ah, but that's a very big picture, but it's only ooh, ah. But you know they've done something wrong, or owie, or something like that. So owie is another one. Owie, I've hurt myself. Yowie. It's all toning, so.
According to him, the Yowie is more than just a terrifying monster. It's a spirit.
Everyone's had a spiritual experience. Everyone's had an experience in the bush where they felt something, but they've never been able to see it or communicate about it. That's so when you get that feeling that you're out of place or doing something that's not kosher or true, you get the hair stand up in your back, and you get that, you know, some people will fall into that space where they can't move their physical bodies. It's because you're breaking law. You've stepped into an energetical area that you were moving too fast into, and it stopped you to say, hey, don't come any closer. It's just the same if I walked into your house and didn't respect you and just come blurting through to your kitchen, open your fridge up and gone, oh, I want to take this, and you're sitting there looking at me walking through your house going, what are you doing here and who are you? It's the same sort of thing. That's what I know the Yowie to be. It's an ancestral part of ourselves that's sort of been lost in time, what they call it, lost in that space, that gap, that history can't put a time on. Nothing can put a time on.
That's the calls that I've heard them make.
But to Gary Opet, the Yowie is a carnivore, a terrifying flesh and blood creature.
So this is best of all lookouts at sunset. This is at Yowie time. This is the time encounters have occurred. Queensland, in many localities, is very undisturbed. It's subtropical, and so you've got a better higher rainfall, and so you've got more abundant insects, and the animals that prey on the insects, bandicoots, and the small kangaroos called paddymellons that graze on the rainforest leaves, apparently all provide food for these yowies. They don't live in large numbers. We imagine they're only in small family groups, and we don't even know how many families there may be of them, but enough to survive and continue to increase. But of course, we don't have evidence, physical evidence, that this animal actually exists, purely anecdotal evidence. We go entirely on the stories that people tell us, but the stories are so similar. They're not telling us so that they can become famous or wealthy or anything, because most people don't believe them. It's a bizarre experience coming across some large, hairy, ape-like, yeti-like animal.
Ray Doherty and Ron Quinton make their way into the Springbrook National Park in Queensland on the hunt for the Yowie.
So we're heading to a walking track in the Maples State Forest. This is where we had an experience a couple of months back, where we walked inside and we believe we got surrounded by 4 of them. They were vocalising, throwing rocks, breaking branches, a real classic, you know, male demonstration of power and authority. Here it is here on the right. We have a theory about what these creatures are. We believe that they're an undiscovered great ape, an uncharted great ape. These things are far smarter than a gorilla or an orangutan or a chimpanzee, but they live in a very similar way. We think that they're largely nocturnal. We know that their smell's good because we also know that they'll see you before you even know they're there. And they don't see very well in direct sunlight. Fingers crossed. You never know with these things. They like corn. We found they like sweet corn. So we're going to take a few pieces in with us and leave it, throw them around, leave them in places and see if it helps us. We'll just head in.
The alleged habitat of the Yowie is both beautiful and potentially lethal. It's home to deadly creatures like the venomous Sydney funnel-web spider. Rural Australia is also home to 8 of the 10 most dangerous snake species in the world. This is not a place for the inexperienced.
It's grown a lot more since we were here last. It's really densed out. It's probably going to favour them a lot, so we'll see how we get on. This is about as far as we got last time. Here we heard them walking, and when we got up to that corner is where they had us. One up there, one out there, one down there, and one over there. Look at this perfect rainforest canopy, man. It's just, people be walking through here unaware, and they'll just be living here, observing. And if they're anywhere, they're either down there watching us, or they're up here. Hang on. Dead up, straight up here in the middle.
Yeah, I can see.
You can see it? Might be something, might be nothing. But it's just leaves and stuff. We're looking for a lot of convergent behaviour between the African apes and what this thing is, and we have found traits of chimp, we've found traits of orangutan, we've found traits of gorillas in all the activity, and of course tree climbing is one of all of them. But we look for some of the really dark patches and trees and unusual congregations of leaves and branches, because what we find with them, they will, like the others, they'll construct a nest and where they can see everyone and everything approaching. Here, as you can see, there's millions of places where they can hide.
For Ray, the Yowie is a member of an as-yet-undiscovered species of monkey, a theory dismissed by many cryptozoologists.
Australia, New Zealand, Antarctica, Africa, South America, it was all one continent. This is in the times of the dinosaurs. We've never reached East Asia, so we don't have any Asian animals here. So there's no apes at all, no apes whatsoever.
Shh, just quietly, stay on the dirt.
You hear that down there then?
You hear that? Hang on. Shh, shh. From what primatology tells us, they're non-threatening noises, and they're the noises that we've observed females of them making. We believe that the loud calls that everyone does throughout the world are alarm calls, we think. Grab a piece of corn, and hopefully if they're watching us and they see it, then they might recognise it from when we last left it here. See if anything moves towards it. So far, not luck. So if they're there, they're staying very quiet, or they're not here. So keep pushing on a little bit further, yeah? Whoop.
Attempting to attract the Yowie with plant food is futile, according to Gary Opet. He believes fresh meat is more likely to pique its appetite.
If these Yowies exist, and they appear to exist, it doesn't seem to be a vegetarian like a gorilla. Carnivores are naturally energy savers. So like lions and normal predators, leopards and tigers, they'll sleep for 20 hours a day. They might be active for 4. So this animal is liable to behave in exactly the same way, which is why they're not often seen. People have found what looks like a small teepee where a bunch of trees have been arched together, and then inside will be all feathers or fur from a plucked cat, as if something was sitting in this natural bush hide, grabbed something and torn it, plucked it, and then presumably taken it off and eaten it.
Unusual sound, you hear that? Like a cat call. Hey? I've never heard it before in my life either. I don't know what it is. It sounds like something dying. Right, something up there. It's making noises, I can hear it. Oh, it sounds like an underarm rock. Don't anyone move.
Ray Doherty and Ron Quinton continue their search for the enigmatic Yowie.
Something is here, something's around us. That much I know, because I heard the big thud up there and the big rock. Oh, looks like something's been down there. Now look at here.
Somebody snapped it off.
It's covered in mud. It's been broken off and
pulled out of
and it's been used to dig. Is there any? Oh yeah, you can see something in here, impression. Something's been clawing all over. There's probably a kid while the adult dug. It's reasonable to assume that something's been here digging away and there's a trail leading off that whatever it was left in a fairly decent hurry.
But 100 kilometers or 62 miles away at the University of Brisbane, the scientist Ross Balch believes Ray and Dawn may be searching for the monster forever.
I'm Ross Balch. I'm the president of the Brisbane Skeptic Society. So I'm actually a biologist. Science and research is really my passion, and I guess it helps me as a skeptic as well, because the scientific method is the core of everything that we do. I've come across things that people can't immediately explain, but I don't think I've ever come across anything that's unexplainable. Sometimes you just have to say, I don't know, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's something weird. Well, the Yowie's a very interesting character or myth. I know it comes from ancient Aboriginal cultures originally, but sightings of the Yowie actually decreased for a long time, and it wasn't until the 70s where sightings picked up again, and I think really it became another cultural phenomenon. You know, it became one of those stories that Australians like to hear about. I think the more culturally prevalent something is, the more likely people are to attribute that idea to something that they can't explain. If you're primed to want to see a Yowie, and you see something in the bushes that you can't explain, your brain might be much more likely to morph it into something that to you looks like a Yowie than, say, to me as a skeptic would. I think most people just like the idea of being able to find one and being the first, you know, the first to have the evidence that everyone's so desperate to find. I think that's what makes it such a good story in a way, because it's undiscovered still. But unfortunately, without any evidence, it seems unlikely to me that the Yowie's out there.
But doubts about the monster's existence aren't slowing down Ray and Dawn. They intend to continue their quest at all costs.
See, look here, Ron. Look here. This could be water run. You can see here, like if it was water run, it would go straight over the edge. I don't think it's water, because water would just come over, right, and go straight down there. But this has gone on an angle on purpose. Probably a few days old, but you can see something has gone down in through there and into the ferns, deeper into that rainforest gully. This could be a human trail, but as you can see how dense the jungle and the mountains are here, I don't know why people would be walking down. So that's a sign that something's gone down there. So we'll leave a few little gifts as we go, so they don't think we're all bad in the open. So we'll head back out. And even just where we went's a bit of a walk, isn't it? You know, we know that from previously there's a couple up on the hill and there's a couple down in the valley, and I think there were a couple watching us today. Well, did you hear those footsteps? Yeah, definitely heard a rock that landed, a big rock, boom, very close, and that rock, that was a rock, a big rock that was thrown that I heard, and I definitely think something was certainly watching us for sure. There's a couple of trails that we saw that went off the main trail. The first instance you would say rain runoff, but remember it hasn't rained up here for a few months, and that looked like it was made within the last week or two maybe, but looked like something human sized had gone down there. So if they are a basic animal but just smarter than a gorilla and everything, what are they driven by? They're driven by shelter, water, for food, and the need to reproduce. So that's how we've got to track them. I mean, I feel like there was something with us, but at the end of the day, without a visual confirmation and a good, decent vocal, who knows?
Since the 1970s, Gary Opet has had several meetings with the terrifying Yowie. The most recent took place here, in the forests of Springbrook.
So I was walking down this track. It was around about this time of night. It was very quiet and still, and I could hear a very large animal pushing its way through the vegetation around about 40 or 50 metres in. And then there was a loud crack, like that. And then another crack, and then another crack. This continued for 3 or 4 minutes, and I was looking with my binoculars. I just got glimpses of something covered in what looked like brown hair and was standing maybe my height. It was difficult to discern the height. Might have been 1.5 metres, might have been more. And then it went quiet. I then pushed my way into the forest, but it must have moved off very quietly, and I wasn't able to find anything at all. The only animal that we know of that was so large and could sneak away without making a sound, of course, is the Yowie.
But for Ross Balch, Gary Opet's experiences have a very simple explanation.
I think humans have a nature of humanizing things that they see. There's a psychological effect called Paradolia, and Paradolia is the process by which the brain essentially takes things which are random and assigns meaning to them. And the human brain's very good at morphing things you can't quite distinguish into very human-looking creatures. And it seems to me it's much more likely to be a possum based on the behavior of the creature than a Yowie, for instance. You know, a possum is a branch dweller, and it could look like the head of a bigger creature when in fact it's just a smaller creature at a height which seems like it's the correct place for something else. If you saw that out of the corner of your eye, the rustle of the bushes, you might easily mistake that for a very human-like creature.
One theory posits that the Yowie is a descendant of the Neanderthals.
Darwin's theory of evolution was only a theory, a common, widely accepted theory, but there also is the missing link. Maybe these things are it.
So the Yowie, it looks very much like a large ape-like creature. It's almost like a Neanderthal, like a hairy Neanderthal.
And we believe that they came here through the 2 ice ages when the water levels of the Torres Strait were so low you could almost walk across.
Another hypothesis suggests that the Yowie is a survivor of the era of the Australian megafauna, which dates from 20 to 50,000 years ago.
It could be one of our prehistoric marsupials.
Australia wasn't covered in snow. Australia was a tropical rainforest that was in drought, and during that time we had a thing called megafauna, which was basically supersized plants, animals.
We had giant koalas that were as big as hippopotamuses and rhinoceroses.
Marsupials today that are the size of a cat that were as big as a car.
There are some Aboriginal cave paintings of these animals, and we know these animals from their fossils, from their skeletons found in caves.
You have these megafaunas, and if this creature is a remnant of that, you can try to understand them and study them more.
No one really is sure because we don't have any physical evidence that they actually exist.
In Australia, we know very well the history of primates in this country. In fact, there's only one that we know of, and that is, of course, humans. By the time humans reached Australia, humans had already evolved into the form that we see today. And of course, the Aboriginal people have been here for a long time. And it seems unlikely, because we don't have any evidence to the contrary, that any other type of hominid species has been to Australia. For another one to have existed here for as long as a Yowie would have had to, again, we would have found fossils, bones, some kind of evidence that the existence of the Yowie was indeed true.
They leave almost no impression of themselves, occasional footprints, and they look like very large human footprints, very primate-like.
The Yowie itself isn't amazingly far-fetched in terms of the physiology. You know, you only have to look at some of the early humans, the way that they had a lot of hair, but the stance of the Yowie doesn't make as much sense. Early hominids were very crouched, they weren't as upright as humans, and looking at the size of its feet, you know, based on the cast that people say they have.
I have with me an actual footprint of the Yowie, and you can see by my hand, quite an amazing animal.
You know, that evidence doesn't correlate with the other characteristics which it would have to have, unfortunately. So it doesn't make much sense biologically, that the body plan doesn't really make much sense. And that's another reason why I find it hard to believe that the Yowie is out there somewhere.
It's not as if you've only had one report from one person. I get other photographs and reports from other people. I've had drawings that people have done for me of what they've seen, and it's always the same animal.
An anecdote is interesting, and it's certainly a basis for more study, but an anecdote isn't evidence.
Mostly people get the shock of their life, and it makes a major impact on them because suddenly they've encountered something that they never imagined existed.
But a story is just a story until it's confirmed by something that can't be morphed and shaped and changed over successive iterations of remembering something.
Ray Doherty will continue his search for the Yowie, even though he believes he has proof to confound even the most ardent skeptic.
We photograph anomalous shapes, anomalous colours, and we have found on some of them a creature of some kind that doesn't fit our flora and fauna records sitting in a tree. We've got one photo which you can clearly see. You can see a chest, you can see an arm, and you can see what looks like a head.
None of those are good enough to make a positive identification. There's always some kind of issue. It's blurry, or it could easily be another animal. I think if any of them were a bit less blurry or unambiguous, it would still be hard to call that conclusive proof without actually having a physical specimen. The idea of a Yowie existing in nature it's quite a remote possibility, really, because of genetics and inbreeding. If you have a population less than around 50 to 100, it's almost impossible, especially for a creature as big as a Yowie is purported to be able to continue to breed and sustain a population. And I think, given the numbers it would take over such a large area as Australia, we would definitely have found solid evidence by now if the Yowie did exist.
Still, a majority of Australians doubt that a real monster wanders freely in their tropical forests.
See the little boy?
But the legend amuses people and has become part of the local folklore.
It's the local football team of the Yowies, and they play on the Yowie fields over here. That scares the opposition. The town and the council and tourism rode on the legend of the Yowie, I guess. And where we're sitting now is Yowie Park. They hold the markets here every couple of weeks. Well, as you can see, people bring their wares along, some of them homemade, everything around the place. You can buy Yowie bread and Yowie burgers and Yowie everything.
Yowie Coffee was established back in 2005. It's a good spot. I just wanted to get out of the hustle and bustle of Brisbane, you know, and what better place than Kilcoy here in Queensland to do that. Kilcoy is almost the capital of the Yowie country, I believe. Something that tourists are attracted to, you know. Some of them even come out here to look for the Yowie. And whether you believe it or not, you know, it's a great story.
Is the Yowie more myth than monster? There are still those who want to believe.
I think there's some type of off-breed of the gorilla, personally, but I don't know. A lot of people think they're supernatural. They just appear and disappear.
Yeah, oh, you know them, you know when they're there. Hair stand up on your back, man.
It's a truly wonderful thing because we may have an unknown animal.
You know, and they're not nuts, these people. They're seeing something, and it's not just a shadow in the bush.
Well, I've seen one several times, but I hope to see one close up and try to build a relationship with something that's not human or partly human. We know it is partly human.
I mean, it could be an Australian man, Homo australiensis.
You can go so far with belief and faith and trust, I guess, but a bit of physical evidence. A handful of hair would be good.
Everyone's fascinated by the past. We all wish we could have a time machine. If the Yowie was out there, it would almost be as good as having one. It would tell us something about where we've come from and also possibly where we're going.
And until we actually get one in the flesh, I don't think anyone's going to know.
Now, you don't believe in them. I'll take you up there and leave you in the scrub at night on your own and see if you don't believe in the morning.